This is the development planning and phasing presentation, so it dovetails with some of the other presentations we've been going through today. And we'll go a little bit more into sequencing and phasing. For that, I'll just introduce the team. I'm Chris Glaciak, I'm the Vice President for Planning and Design at Waterfront.
And I'm QUAY McIntosh, and I'm the Waterfront Project Director of the City of Toronto.
So Gwen and I have been working on this material and this presentation jointly, as has all of this effort been done as a joint task force between the City and Waterfront Toronto to go back and look at the environmental assessment and look at ways to see if this can be built in phases. And that's what I'm going to try and talk about, and Gwen will talk about as well. Quick outline of the presentation. I'm going to talk just about scale comparisons with other development projects and talk a little bit about the market demand, demand for development that we forecast for the area, and then some phasing ideas, both in terms of phasing the river and flood protection and phasing development as it comes along. So just in terms of scale comparison, the Portlands is about 1,000 acres, and you see it over there on the right. On the left here are two very large scale, considered to be very large scale development projects. One, Canary Wharf, which is kind of the flagship development project of this era. It's about 100 acres. It's been built out over a period of more than 20 years. Started off with a couple of buildings and shuttle bus service, then upgraded to a streetcar service, and then eventually they built a full subway line out there. It was an incremental process, and it's now a thriving part of the city. But as you can see, it is only about a quarter of the size of the Portland, and that by itself was considered a massive project when it was started. Mission Bay in San Francisco, another one. That's a little bigger, but still not as big as Portland. Another long-term one. Here we've got two examples from the city. So on the top, you see North York City Center. All of that would fit on the north side of the Portland alone. And on the south side, we've got a purple line around the Railway Lands Complex, Sky Dome, Air Canada Center, and then all the new development that's happening to the east of that. Any way you slice it, this is a long-term project that we're looking at for the Portland. In 20 years is not going to be enough time to fill it all up. And I use this as an example to explain that. If you take our existing city and put it on the Portlands, you put Spadina, where Cherry Street is, the Portlands would go all the way to Parliament, and that's where Leslie Street is. And if you set Dundas at the Lakeshore Boulevard, all of the Portlands would get you all the way down to Front Street. So you've got City Hall and the red circle, Union Station and the red box, Front Street where Unwin Avenue is today. That's really the whole center of our city. And you don't build that in 5 years or even 50 years. It's been in the works for 150 years and it's still evolving and growing. So whatever happens in the Portlands, there isn't going to be one developer and one project that comes in and does it all. It's going to have to evolve over time. So we've looked at ways to break this into some smaller segments that might be able to evolve in a kind of rational or somewhat rational way, so that we get something that adds up to a great piece of the city in the long term. So to do that, we've tried to identify some of the main elements that we want to protect for, and want to make sure survive whatever transitions and phases go on. So we've got several major north-south connections we know we want to make. Cherry Street, Don Roadway, potential connection from Broadview down Leslie Street, from the point of view of which are the ones that are the most valuable to make sure we put to the highest and best use. So ones that have great views back to the city, or great waterfront views, or are proximate to the new naturalized river mouth. So that's kind of the base framework that we started with, and then we took market demand, which if you were at one of the other sessions, this was talked about in more detail. But the consultant team that we brought on board looked at absorption rates, so how much of this type of stuff gets built and occupied every year in the whole GTA, and then what portion of that could you realistically expect to attract to the Portlands. Because for GTA-wide, you're not going to get every single residential unit that gets built in the city of Toronto in the next 10 years. It isn't going to happen in the Portlands, they'll be happening all over. Some portion of it will come here. So based on their analysis, they came up with 6,700 to 8,000 residential units And at sort of average densities that we have been working with on the waterfront, that takes about 40 to 80 acres of land. Office development, we're looking at about 2 million to 4 million square feet of demand for that over the next 20 years. Again, it takes about 40 to 90 acres. Retail, we've looked only at retail demand that would be generated by these uses. So if you built all of this and you built all of this, how much retail would you support? So it's a local service retail approach that we have taken. We have not modeled a shopping mall. We do know that there's demand for another large shopping center somewhere in the city. That's something that we've learned and that people, I think, generally accept. Maybe it could go in the Portlands, maybe it goes somewhere else. We haven't tested it or tried it at this point. We're just looking at service retail. The industrial and port uses,
Yeah, just quickly, because it just says to be determined, and the work that has been done so far by the consultants have looked at some of the traditional and industrial uses, looking at manufacturing uses, not really seeing much growth in that. What we are working with the consultants now is looking at really a wider range of what we would consider employment uses. We know that there has been demand for these uses in the Portlands. We've had a new post office distribution center. There's a lot of users who tell us they want to stay there, they want to expand. So we are working that through, and this will be a number that we'll work through and be able to basically update, I guess, as we come forward with the next phases.
Question, how many acres are floating for industrial and port?
There isn't on here.
Well, you're giving ranges, so
Yeah.
if you took all low ranges, for instance, the low of each range, how much would there be for industrial?
And that's the to be determined piece as far as the absorption. Because if you look at just, say you said, okay, how much would we need for manufacturing? It's not going to be very much. But if you start saying, okay, what would we be looking at? Is there a demand for other types of employment uses? So we don't know that number yet, so that will come.
What is it currently?
Well, it's all zoned for industrial, so it's about 1,000. I can't tell you off the top of my head how much is vacant, but I mean, if you go there, it's primarily industrial uses. Well, I'm actually thinking mainly on the north, there's really no servicing on the south.
this is just demand for this type of use. It's not directly tied to the amount of land you've got. If you add all of these up and assume you get a number for industrial, right now you're looking at only 85 to 180 acres of land needed to accommodate all of the demand for new residential, new office, and new retail in the next 20 years in the Portlands. And that is about 10 to 20% of the Portlands area. So the other 90 to 80% we don't need for the next 20 years to meet this demand. And maybe we need a little bit of it for whatever industrial type uses we think might come along. So taking that, we've tried to look at, okay, how might you start building this out to accommodate that space, and what does it take up of the Portlands, and where does it go? So in order to build in the Portlands, we have to flood protect most of it. We have to bring infrastructure to it, and we have to bring not only roads and bridges and things like that, but also the underground infrastructure, the water pipes, sewer pipes, etc. So one place you could start is here. This is actually now out of the floodplain because of the berm we built in the West Donlands, which also has enabled Pan Village to go right here. So you don't need to spend any money on flood protection to build on these two sites. You do, however, need some infrastructure. So local infrastructure is the interstitial stuff, so the sort of local roads, the local sewers and pipes. And major infrastructure is, in this case, extending Queens E all the way through here, realigning Cherry Street so you get a proper intersection here, because right now it is not a viable intersection for any kind of development to happen around it. And trunk lines, trunk service lines. Those two items together add up to about $130 million. So that is the infrastructure investment required for that land to become developable. And if you look at the amounts that we have here, A and B together accommodate about 60% of the anticipated 20-year demand for residential development. They account for about 50% of all commercial demand, in the next 20 years, and there's enough space to do 100% of the retail demand. So these two areas alone take us a long way towards meeting that 20-year demand without even touching any other land in the Port Lands.
Do your infrastructure costs include transit?
There is no transit included here. What we're trying to do with this whole exercise is what are the things we have to do to make it developable. And one thing that's already happening is transit is being extended down Cherry Street right to this point as part of the Pan Am Village, and that is really within a walking range of that neighborhood. As we start to get farther into the Portlands, we do have to put in transit. That's what we were told by the market sounding. People are not going to start building down here and over here until there's a transit system of some sort. So we could do those two and then these two, or you could leave these two out of the equation and start with these two. To do that, you need to build this spillway, which is one of the components of the river flood protection system. That costs about $60 million for flood protection. That's what that P stands for. So for $60 million, you take these out of the floodplain. You still have the local infrastructure and major infrastructure to deal with. Cherry Street needs to be raised. All this land needs to be raised about a meter. So we need to rebuild Cherry Street about a meter higher than it is now. Replace the bridge that's here. Bring trunk sewer lines down, and then feed those on local roads into the development sites in order to have those ready for development. So that is a costlier way to start. It's about $285 million you're going to need to invest in infrastructure for development to take place on those two sites.
Excuse me, and does that number include the transit component that would be extended?
No, still no transit here. We're still pretty close to this transit line. There could be a shuttle bus service or some very interim type transit to get people from here up to the streetcar. So these and these, we didn't project having to do a major transit investment. After this, you start seeing the transit investments pop up on the screen. So these two areas get about 112% of the residential demand. So these two areas alone can handle all the residential demand that we foresee in the next 20 years, and about 40% of the commercial demand. And part of the reason for the difference in different areas is while we see it all as mixed use, we see the mix as being different in some places than others. So here the mix would be more heavily residential, with less commercial, and here it'd be the opposite. More commercial, a little less residential, because this is the city's, one of the city's employment zones. So we can zone it so that the balance changes depending on where you are and depending on what the density is.
How much should the cost, if you were to do both of the heating and this, how much would that cost end up supporting that?
They're completely separate. It's additive, so you have to go back to the other one, spend that, and do this if you want to do both.
The area A, doesn't have A in either, but the first circle closer to the city, that's privately owned, right?
That's right.
Will the costs, the infrastructure costs to service that demand, will the developer be required to pay that, or will that be another public fund?
So that's a good question. We're not at that point in this analysis yet.
What is the question?
The question was, will the developers pay for some of that infrastructure cost? And so we're not there yet. What we have done for the purposes of today is try to look at what do you need to do to unlock these lands, and what does that cost? So you need to flood protect, how much does that cost? You need infrastructure, how much does that cost? So all we've done so far is the cost side of the equation. When we come back in a month or so for the next round of public meetings, we'll then be coming with the revenue side of the equation, where we'll look at different scenarios for development charges against developers, or tax increment financing, or a whole host of things are being considered. Some are viable, some aren't. And at the end of the day, we'll see how much revenue we can get. And if we're lucky, it will cover itself. And it also may not cover itself, so we don't know yet. So we're just talking about costs today. How we recover them, that's our next phase of work. Another scenario is to, if you've built the spillway already, you could build a sediment basin, which we need to collect all the debris that comes down the river, but more importantly, get the sediment out of there. So if we don't, eventually the riverbed fills up and we have flooding all over again. So we need a new sediment basin. bridge here, this is Lakeshore Boulevard under the black line. It's a short bridge, it needs to be lengthened, it's not wide enough right now for the water flows and big storm events to get through. So we risk floods along this area, in this area. This is all burned up now, but this side, hanging up here. And then we need to raise the roadway. Again, like we did the Cherry, it has to go up about a meter on berm. That is about $140 million. So it might have to be over here. To do the sediment basin, lengthen the Lakeshore Bridge, put the Donna roadway up on the berm. What that does, flood protect everything on this side. So it takes all South Riverdale out of the flood zone, and it takes all these plants and the programs out of the flood zone. It also costs $140 million to do. So that's a big number in and of itself just for flood protection. And then again, we have local and major infrastructure that add up quite a bit. So here we're rebuilding Commissioners, which is a major road, and a couple of major north-south roads. None of this has good servicing underground. Plus, we're looking at about $80 million in bringing transit out here. And we're done. This number is a bit of a loose number, because we don't know exactly what that transit system would be or how it would be phased in. But that's what we carry to either get temporary service rail out here or some kind of high-speed bus system. Could be a little more, could be a little less, but it's probably, based on the other transit projects, sort of a good number to start with. And you see the total investment to liberate all of that paint is $1 billion. And I had to take this out of the flow chart. So things start to add up to very large numbers pretty quickly. And then the last component is finishing the river, finishing the flood protection. We still need this piece to actually handle all the flood volumes. And that will take these lands out of the flood zone. And they become developable. So at this point, we have finished the flood protection. Digging this piece, including naturalizing the banks of the river, $240 million. Some big-ish numbers in local and major infrastructure, and then a bigger transit number to probably bring the streetcar here down Cherry and across Commissioners, or maybe down Donna roadway and across Commissioners. These numbers are kind of based on linear amounts of the system that we build. So that gets us transit that makes these sites developable. So that's another $740 million that we need to make that. So big numbers again. That has achieved flood protection but not naturalization because this part has remained so far unchanged. There's a long-term private tenant here and an owner here who we do not want to take out. We will likely want to leave them there until they're ready to go, and then when they do, we can naturalize that for about $7 million, and then on the south we can naturalize that for about $8 million. So once we get to this drawing, we've got full flood protection, full naturalization of the whole mouth of the river, all the infrastructure everywhere that we need for development, and the numbers are big. So the river project, the flood protection project is about $400 million to $450, depending on how it's paid. Naturalization outside of the main flood protection is another $15 million. All that local infrastructure is about $500 million. Major infrastructure, almost $1 billion. Transit, we're looking at $750 million. So getting all of this ready for development is about $2.1 billion worth of investment that we have to find. So that's what we'll try to match with the revenues if we can. Not so clear that it can be done. So that's the goal is to try, and if we can, that's great. And then we need to find other ways, government money or something, to do some parts of the project and tackle at this point in time. So yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Glenn, and she'll kind of explain how those things can get looked at.
So what Chris is taking you through is that we're really looking to develop a comprehensive planning framework, and what we're doing here is to set the roadmap for the next phases of development planning and phasing for the portlands. So as mentioned, I mean, this has been looking at the river as far as the flood protection, looking at the objectives outlined in the EA, the requirements for naturalization, flood protection, and city building, and coming up with an option which is an optimization of what the preferred option was. Given the numbers that we've been looking at, the importance of looking at phasing to be able to bring forward whether it's infrastructure or flood protection. Because I think what's important is we want to deliver the flood protection. We don't want lands that are in a floodplain. So part of this is looking at, can we implement the flood protection in a phased way to pull lands out of the floodplain? So that is part of the phasing strategy. And as was mentioned before, looking at is releasing these lands prior to full implementation, that's got to work in terms of functionality and cost. So Chris showed you some options on where, if you look at what the market is being told as far as market absorption, the amount of development you may see, and there's different ways you can look at where that may go, but you need that in an overall framework, so that it's happening in what you want to see for the entire footprint. So that's what we're working on now. So we are not at this stage into we're up here, and then you have to sort of get into now how do we start planning those pieces. And what will come out with this project is some recommendations on how to move forward with those other pieces. We're talking about green space, frameworks, power planning, all of those other policy pieces that are captured in one way in the city's official plan, which then requires a level of precinct planning. It gets into the details of basically delivering neighborhoods and communities. So we're at that higher level now. This is information that we have now. We'll have more information, particularly on the revenue end of things, when we come back and speak with you and get your comments back in May, and then we'll have a feedback session for everything in the